So you should have already learned about the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. Your pulmonary circulatory system, remember, is where the right side of the heart pumps blood out to the lungs to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Then that blood travels back to the left side of the heart, and when the left side of the heart contracts, that oxygenated blood is pushed out into arteries so that it can travel out through the systemic circulation to body tissues, all areas of the body, to drop off that oxygen and pick up CO2 and return it right back to the right side of the heart. Well, we also want to consider some special circulations as well. So as we take a brief look at these, we'll begin with the circle of Willis. So the circle of Willis is an arterial anastomosis, and you should have learned already that an anastomosis is simply an alternate pathway. So if you look at the back of your hands on the posterior surface, you can see that between those superficial blood vessels that are the large vessels, you can also see some very small little vessels that connect the larger. Those provide alternate pathways. Now that's a very, very simplistic anastomosis, but you find these in very simple and also very complex fashions in many areas of the body. One of the most important is the arterial anastomosis in the brain, that is the circle of Willis. And this makes sure that the brain has proper blood supply. I mean, imagine if there were areas of the brain that didn't get blood flow, didn't get perfusion, then that area of the brain couldn't function, the tissues would die, and of course this could very easily lead to death. So here you can see the circle of Willis is formed by the internal carotid arteries, the anterior communicating arteries, and the posterior communicating arteries. So this allows for blood to be rerouted if a particular vessel is blocked for any reason. The pulmonary circuit, remember, as I mentioned earlier and as you've seen already, is responsible for taking that blood out to the lungs. And in the lungs you have these tiny little air sacs called alveoli. So alveoli is plural of alveolus. So the capillaries that take that blood, remember when the right side pumps, you push blood out through the pulmonary trunk, the right and left pulmonary arteries out to smaller and smaller, I'm sorry, my mouse got stuck, out to smaller and smaller arterioles, and then all the way out to teeny tiny little pulmonary capillaries. In those pulmonary capillaries, CO2 diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, and the alveoli, the air sacs, are going to allow for diffusion of oxygen into the pulmonary capillaries, and then that oxygenated blood U-turns in those pulmonary capillaries into small venules, and then those venules merge into larger pulmonary veins that brings that oxygen-rich blood back to the left side of the heart. So the pulmonary circuit is all about gas exchange, getting blood to and from the lungs to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Hepatic portal circulation refers to the liver. You knew hepatic meant liver, right? A portal is an entryway where several smaller passages merge into a larger passage. So as blood is traveling from the intestinal tract, part of the gastrointestinal tract, right? That blood is very, very nutrient rich. By pooling all of that blood from the splenic vein, the superior and inferior mesenteric vein, and the gastric vein into the hepatic portal vein, all of that blood from the intestines, from the gastrointestinal tract, pulls back into, or is pooled back into the liver. And remember, one of the jobs of the liver is to filter and to clean. So the blood is, in fact, cleaned up a little bit so that any toxins or anything that you don't necessarily want back into circulation can be filtered out in the liver. But one of the also very important functions of filtering that blood back through the liver is to just take some of those nutrients from the digestive system and store them. So the liver is able to sequester some of the excess nutrients. You don't use all of the nutrients from your food every time you eat. So why not store some in the pantry? So think of the liver as the pantry. Some of those nutrients are stored so that they can be utilized when the body is low. You have low blood sugar, right? So the liver can store that excess sugar as glycogen, and then using the endocrine system and glucagon, break that down so that we can dump those single sugar molecules, that glucose, into the blood and restore blood sugar levels back to normal. So the liver sort of functions as the pantry. We bring all of that digestive blood through all of those veins into the hepatic portal system, filter it, and then return the blood to the circulation through the hepatic vein. Fetal circulation is different from your circulation, my circulation, all adults, or anyone that's not a fetus. Well, how and why is it different? In the fetus, remember, the lungs are not breathing in oxygen, and the digestive system is not taking in food, right? Can't eat when you're in the uterus, can't breathe when you're in the uterus. So there are some modifications that allow the placenta to exchange nutrients and gases from mom's circulatory system into that developing fetus. So from the placenta, the umbilical vein brings nutrient and oxygen-rich blood into the fetus. Remember, V-E-I-N, vein, brings blood in. So in this case, we're talking about not bringing blood back into the heart, but into the fetus. The umbilical arteries, A for away, arteries take dirty blood, used blood, waste products, deoxygenated blood, away from the fetus and back to the placenta. Now remember, the placenta is the connection between mom and that fetus. So it's made up of blood vessels that allow for nutrients and oxygen to diffuse from mom's blood into the placenta and then into baby's circulatory system. So those modifications include some structures that we're going to look at next. Hang on just a second. My touchy little mouse here doesn't want to cooperate. There we go. So most of the umbilical blood is going to travel directly to the right atrium in a vessel called the ductus venosus. Most of that blood that enters the right atrium, though, doesn't go into the right ventricle. Instead, it's shunted through an opening into the left atrium. That opening is called the foramen ovale, oval hole. Now, why do you think that happens? Yeah, you remember, I just told you, right? The fetus is not using the lungs for gas exchange, so there's no point in taking all that blood that enters the right atrium down to the right ventricle and then out to the lungs for gas exchange. We just need to take a good bit of blood out there to nurture, to supply those developing tissues, but not for gas exchange. So most of that blood that just came from the placenta in that ductus venosus travels through the foramen ovale into the left atrium and then goes into the pulmonary circuit. So the blood that does enter the pulmonary trunk after going into the right atrium and the right ventricle, some of that is going to be further shunted into the aorta in a little passageway called the ductus arteriosus, a duct between the arteries. So this also takes some of that already nutrient-rich blood and sends it into the systemic circulation. Now, after the baby is born, of course, these structures are no longer needed. And in fact, it would be dangerous if these openings, these passageways, these shunts remained open. So baby's lungs have to start functioning shortly after birth as the pressure within the thoracic cavity and within the chest or within the heart changes as the lungs fill with oxygen. You're going to get much more of this in your lecture. Get the big picture here. So the ductus arteriosus has to close, and it becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. And of course, that ligament-like structure is going to be between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. The foramen ovale closes to become sort of a fibrous little patch of tissue that's in the interatrial septum. Ooh, there's some terminology for you, right? Interatrial, between the atria, septum, dividing wall. So the foramen ovale, which was that hole becomes a fibrous fossa ovalis that is in the interatrial septum. The ductus venosus becomes very fibrous as well and becomes the ligamentum venosum that you can see in the liver. The umbilical veins, again, become very fibrous and become the ligamentum teres, and the umbilical arteries become medial umbilical of the umbilicus, the navel, ligaments associated with the umbilicus. And this, of course, just shows you those in a different format. So you had them in the image on the previous slide, and here you have them in nice little boxes. All right, so that concludes our special circulation.